Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep inside the world of ethical hacking. We're going to figure out how those penetration testers use Kali Linux, a pretty powerful tool. You want to know how it works, right? Well, we're going to break it all down. By the end, you'll understand all the key concepts and lingo. You'll know what penetration testing really is, and you'll get a feel for just how capable Kali Linux is.
That sounds like a plan.
Our guide for this deep dive is Mastering Kali Linux 4th Edition by Vijay Kumar Valu. It's not your typical boring tech book, I'll tell you that.
It really isn't. This book does a great job of explaining how penetration testing, it's not just about finding any old vulnerability, it's about simulating a real attack. To see how serious the risk actually is.
It's like you're stress testing your security systems, right?
Right.
Like knowing there's a broken window, that's one thing. But you really need to know, can someone actually get in through that broken window?
Exactly. And speaking of those, someone's trying to get in. It's important to understand who we're talking about when we say attackers. It's a whole range of people, and they all have their own reasons and goals.
You're right. It's not always some guy in a hoodie in a dark room.
You got it. There are hacktivists, driven by some cause, script kiddies just looking to cause trouble, organized criminals who want money, even nation states doing espionage or trying to disrupt things.
The book even mentions insiders. Like a disgruntled employee out for revenge. Kind of scary when you think about it. Someone right there in your own organization.
Yeah, it adds a whole other level of complexity to things. And that's where frameworks like, the cyber kill chain come in to help us understand the steps involved in a typical cyber attack.
I've heard of the cyber kill chain before, but could you break that down for our listener?
Sure. The book actually uses a modified version of Cloppert's cyber kill chain. It breaks down a cyber attack into 6 main phases. The first phase is explore or reconnaissance. The attackers, they're kind of like digital detectives here. They use open source intelligence, OSINT. Basically, they use tools like Maltego and Shodan to gather intel about their target.
So they're building up a profile, right? Getting a feel for what they're up against.
Exactly. Next comes weaponization and delivery. This is where they choose the right tools for the job, like a malicious email attachment, maybe a USB drive that looks harmless.
They even mention WhatsApping in the book. It just goes to show how creative these attackers can be.
Oh, they're always adapting.
Hmm.
The third phase is exploit compromise. This is the moment they actually get into the target system.
So they're in. They've gotten past the first line of defense. Now what?
Now it's all about achieve action on objective. This is where the attackers go for what they really want. It could be data theft, maybe disrupting operations. They could even deploy ransomware. This is where things can get really bad.
That is scary. So I'm guessing they try to cover their tracks pretty well at this point.
You bet. Phase 5 is cover tracks, where they try to erase all their digital footprints, make it hard to trace them.
So it's not just a smash and grab. They're thinking long term.
Exactly. And that leads us to the final phase. Maintain access. They might leave back doors so they can get back in later, or even try to gain more privileges within the system. They essentially become, an insider threat.
It's like a whole operation.
Yeah.
And that's where Kali Linux comes in, right? The book describes it as the penetration tester's toolkit, with everything they need for each stage of the cyber kill chain.
Yep, that's it. Kali Linux is a special operating system packed with all sorts of tools. What might surprise you is that it's totally free and open source.
Hold on, really? So anyone can download and use it? Doesn't that seem a little, dangerous?
It's a double-edged sword for sure. Both attackers and defenders can use it. That's why it's so important to understand how it works.
So what kinds of tools are we talking about? What can Kali Linux actually do?
Oh, it has a huge range of tools, over 200, I think. And they're organized by what they do. For example, there are 67 tools just for gathering information. Then you've got others for vulnerability analysis, wireless attacks, web application testing, exploiting vulnerabilities, you name it.
Wireless attacks? You mean like hacking Wi-Fi? I think our listeners might find that particularly interesting.
Well, there's a lot to cover there. Ethical hackers use those tools to find and fix weaknesses before the bad guys can get to them. Kali Linux gives them what they need. But before we get into the specifics of those tools, let's talk about how penetration testers use Kali Linux for active reconnaissance.
Active reconnaissance. Now, that sounds a bit risky, doesn't it? It's like you said before, getting closer to that guarded building. You get a better look, sure, but you're also more likely to get caught.
You're right. It is more risky than passive techniques. We'll talk about why that is and how it's done right after this. So active reconnaissance, it is riskier. Like sneaking closer to that building, you get a better view, but might set off some alarms.
Right. You're actually interacting with the target system here, not just watching from afar.
Exactly. Let's say you're an attacker trying to figure out a company's network, right? You could just watch their internet traffic, try to pick up clues about their servers and stuff. That's passive. But if you want to get a really clear picture,
Mm.
you got to start poking around, sending probes to their network, scanning for open ports, even trying to get their servers to respond. That's active recon.
Yeah, I can see how that would be more likely to trip some wires, so to speak. But doesn't that make it harder to stay hidden? We talked about that, how attackers want to cover their tracks.
Because active recon is all about balancing the risk and reward. You want that info, but you don't want to give yourself away.
So how do they do it? How do they avoid setting off those alarms? What are some of the tricks?
The book gets into some pretty cool stuff. They can manipulate their network traffic, make it look like it's coming from somewhere else,
Hmm.
or they might spread out those probes over time so it's harder to spot a pattern.
So it's like they're blending in with all the other network traffic.
Exactly. And that's where Kali Linux shines. It have a whole bunch of tools that help penetration testers do active recon safely and, effectively, like Nmap, for example. It can scan for open ports, tell you what services are running on a system.
So they're not just looking for vulnerabilities, they want the whole picture of the target's network.
Right. Which brings us to the next stage of the cyber kill chain, bypassing security controls. You got firewalls, antivirus, intrusion detection systems. They're all meant to keep the bad guys out. But a skilled penetration tester, they know how to find ways around them.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me even those protections can be bypassed?
Remember, ethical hackers use these techniques for good, right? They're helping organizations improve their security. Think of it like this. It's like a friendly burglar who shows you all the weak points in your house so you can fix them.
Okay, that makes me feel a little better. So how do they actually bypass these controls?
It can get complicated, but basically, they're looking for weaknesses in the way those controls are set up. Maybe a firewall is misconfigured and it lets certain traffic through. Or they might find a bug in some software that lets them skip past authentication.
Sounds like a constant back and forth. Attackers find new ways to exploit things. Defenders try to patch the holes.
It is, and that's where Kali Linux is so valuable. It gives penetration testers a whole arsenal to test those security controls, find any weaknesses.
So it's not just about breaking through. It's about understanding the defenses, figuring out where they're vulnerable.
You got it. And that knowledge is crucial for the next stage, exploitation. This is where they actually take advantage of a vulnerability and get access to a system.
Okay, now things are getting really interesting. Kali Linux must have some tricks for this stage too, right?
Oh, yeah. One of the big ones is Metasploit. It's this framework for developing and using exploits.
Metasploit. We've mentioned it a couple of times. What's so special about it?
Think of Metasploit as a set of building blocks, right? Penetration testers can use it to build custom exploits. It helps them create payloads, which is the code that actually does the attacking, and encoders to disguise that payload so it's harder for security software to catch it.
So they're not just randomly throwing exploits at a target. They're crafting them for each situation.
That's the idea. The book talks about how Metasploit can be used to exploit all kinds of vulnerabilities like buffer overflows, SQL injection flaws.
SQL injection, that's where they mess with database queries, right? To get access to data they shouldn't have. Or even take over the whole database server. I remember reading about that. It sounded pretty bad.
It can be really bad.
Yeah.
And Metasploit makes it kind of easy to exploit those kinds of vulnerabilities. That's why it's such a valuable tool for good guys and bad guys.
So let's say they've used an exploit and they're in, they have access. What happens next?
Well, that's when things get even trickier. They might steal sensitive data, plant malware, even take complete control of the system.
So it's not just about getting in, it's about what they do once they're there.
Right. And that brings us to something called maintaining access. One of the most interesting parts of penetration testing, I think.
Ah, yes, the final stage of the cyber kill chain. This is where they try to stick around, right? Become a permanent resident.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Attackers use all kinds of techniques to make sure they can come back, even if you discover the initial way they got in and patch it up.
So how do they stay hidden for so long? I mean, you'd think they'd get caught eventually.
One common way is to plant backdoors. Think of them as secret entrances that let them bypass all the normal security checks.
Like leaving a hidden key under the mat, but it's a digital key buried deep in the system.
Good analogy. And those backdoors are really hard to find, especially if they're disguised well. They can blend right in with normal system stuff.
So even if you think you've kicked them out, they might already have a way to sneak back in. That's kind of creepy.
It's a constant arms race, for sure. But don't worry, Kali Linux has tools that can help defenders find and remove those backdoors.
Okay, that's a relief. But before we get into how defenders fight back, I want to talk about a specific type of attack that I think our listeners will find really interesting. Web application attacks.
Oh yeah, web applications, they're a prime target these days. And Kali's got a lot of tools specifically for testing their security. It's a pretty complex topic.
Yeah, it seems like everything is online now. So, where do these web application attacks usually begin?
Well, just like with regular network attacks, it often starts with reconnaissance. Attackers try to figure out the structure of the website, where the potential entry points are, what technologies are being used, how the servers are set up.
So, are there tools in Kali that can help with this digital detective work?
Absolutely. Tools like Darebuster, for example. It can automatically find hidden directories and files on a web server. It's like a digital treasure hunt, except they're looking for vulnerabilities, not gold.
And once they've gathered their intel, how do they start looking for weaknesses?
One common technique is called fuzzing. Basically, you bombard the web application with a bunch of unexpected or malformed data. It's kind of like throwing a bunch of stuff at a wall and seeing what sticks. If the application crashes or does something weird, it might mean there's a vulnerability.
So, Kali Linux can help them create this digital chaos to see what breaks.
Yeah, pretty much. Tools like Spike let penetration testers make custom fuzzers for different types of web applications. Then, once they found a potential weakness, they move on to exploitation.
This is where they actually try to break in, right? Take advantage of that
Yeah,
weakness to get access.
exactly. And one of the most popular tools in Kali for this is SQL Map. It's specifically designed to exploit SQL injection vulnerabilities.
SQL injection, we talked about that earlier, how it can be used to bypass security controls. That's where they try to manipulate database queries to steal data or even take control of the database.
That's right. And what's scary is that SQL Map can automate a lot of that process. It makes it a lot easier to exploit those kinds of vulnerabilities. Definitely a powerful tool and not something you want in the wrong hands.
It's incredible how much power these tools give both ethical hackers and the bad guys. It really shows how important it is to have skilled people on defense.
Couldn't agree more. Responsible penetration testers. They use these tools to help organizations find and fix those vulnerabilities before someone with bad intentions can get to them.
I see. It's all about finding the cracks and patching them up before someone else can slip through.
Exactly. And SQL injection is just one example. There are so many other types of web application vulnerabilities out there. Things like cross-site scripting or XSS, cross-site request forgery, or CSRF. Even vulnerabilities in how user sessions are managed.
Session management, that sounds familiar. Is that what happens when you log into a website and it remembers you so you don't have to type your password every time?
Exactly. And if session management isn't done securely, attackers might be able to hijack your session and pretend to be you on the website.
So even if I'm on a website I trust, my session could be hijacked if there's a vulnerability. That's unsettling.
It's definitely something to be aware of. And as web applications get more complex, these vulnerabilities become even harder to find and fix.
So what does Kali Linux have that can help test for all these different web app weaknesses?
Well, besides SQL Map, there's a tool called Burp Suite. It's basically a whole platform for testing web application security.
Burp Suite. I think I've heard of that before. Doesn't it let you intercept and change web traffic?
You got it. It acts like a middleman between your browser and the web server. So you can analyze everything that's being sent back and forth and even change it. It's like having X-ray vision into how a website works.
Wow, that's powerful. So you can see exactly what information is being sent and even mess with it.
Yep. It's really useful for testing how web applications handle different kinds of input. It helps you find vulnerabilities like XSS and CSRF.
So it's not just about scanning for known vulnerabilities. You're actively poking and prodding the application to see how it reacts.
Exactly. And Burp Suite does even more. It has features for fuzzing, scanning for vulnerabilities, even brute forcing login credentials. It's like the ultimate toolkit for web app security testing.
But even beyond finding and using those vulnerabilities, what else can attackers do once they've compromised a web server?
That's where things like web backdoors come in. They might try to create a hidden admin interface or change the code to give them a backdoor. Maybe even upload a malicious file that gives them remote access.
So it's not just about getting in once, it's about making sure they can come back later, even if you fix the original vulnerability.
You got it. And these backdoors can be incredibly difficult to spot, especially if they're well hidden and blend in with the regular code.
It's like they're planting a digital time bomb that they can trigger whenever they want.
The world of cybersecurity can be pretty intense, that's for sure. Speaking of which, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a type of attack that's becoming more and more common these days. Client-side attacks.
Client side, you mean attacks that target the user's computer directly, not the web server.
Exactly. They exploit weaknesses in the user's web browser, plugins, even the operating system itself.
So even if a website is totally secure, the user's own computer could be the weak link.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
One of the most common types of client-side attacks is cross-site scripting, or XSS. We mentioned that earlier.
Right, where attackers inject malicious code into a website, and when someone visits the site, that code runs in their browser.
Yep. And that malicious code can do all sorts of things. Steal your login credentials, redirect you to malicious websites. It can even take control of your computer.
So even visiting a website you trust could be risky if it's been compromised with XSS.
It can be. And Kali Linux has tools that can be used to launch and manage these kinds of attacks. One example is the BEEF framework, which stands for Browser Exploitation Framework.
Beef. That sounds kind of ominous. What exactly does it do?
BEEF lets attackers hook a user's browser once they've visited a compromised website. Then they can run all sorts of attacks against it.
So it's like they're turning the user's own browser against them.
In a way, yeah. BEEF gives the attacker a lot of control over that hooked browser. They can capture keystrokes, steal cookies, take screenshots. They can even launch more attacks against the user's computer or their network.
It's amazing and a little scary how much attackers can do with these client-side attacks. It really highlights the importance of keeping your software updated and being careful about what websites you visit.
Absolutely. As our devices become more connected and reliant on the web, the threat of client-side attacks is only going to grow.
It's been fascinating and a little overwhelming to learn about all these different attack vectors. It really makes you think about the importance of strong security.
You're right about that. And speaking of strong security, let's talk about cloud security. The cloud is such a big part of our lives now, but it also comes with its own unique set of challenges.
And I bet Kali Linux has some tools for dealing with those challenges, right?
It sure does. Cloud environments like Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure, they've become really popular targets for attackers.
So they're not just going after traditional networks and web servers anymore. They're going after the cloud.
Right. Cloud environments often store a ton of sensitive data, and they can be vulnerable to misconfigurations, insecure APIs, and attacks that take advantage of the shared responsibility model of cloud security.
Shared responsibility model. What does that mean?
It means that both the cloud provider and the customer are responsible for keeping things secure. It's like renting an apartment. The landlord takes care of the building's security, but you're responsible for your own apartment.
Okay, I get it. So if a customer doesn't set up their cloud services correctly, they could be leaving themselves open to attack.
Exactly. And Kali Linux offers tools that can help assess cloud security. One example is Scout Suite. It can automatically check cloud configurations and find potential security issues.
So it's like a security scanner specifically for the cloud.
That's a good way to put it. Scout Suite can scan those big cloud environments like AWS, GCP, and Azure and look for common misconfigurations. Things like storage buckets that are publicly accessible, access controls that are too loose, even insecure API endpoints.
Sounds like an important tool for anyone who works with cloud security.
It is. And there are other tools and techniques penetration testers can use for cloud security as well. Exploiting serverless functions, compromising those containerized applications, even attacking the underlying infrastructure itself.
Wow, it seems like there's a whole other world of attack vectors when it comes to the cloud.
There is. And as more and more people and businesses move to the cloud, the need for skilled cloud security professionals is just going to keep growing.
This has been an incredibly insightful look at mastering Kali Linux. It's amazing to see just how many tools and techniques penetration testers use, and how those same tools can be used to make things more secure.
It's all about understanding how attackers think and act so we can stay one step ahead of them.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to move on to the last part of our deep dive. We'll explore some even more advanced techniques that are covered in the book.
Sounds good. We'll be right back to continue our journey into the world of penetration testing with Kali Linux.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're in the home stretch now, wrapping up our exploration of mastering Kali Linux. I'm excited to see what other advanced techniques we uncover.
All right, let's dive into some of those advanced techniques that penetration testers use, the ones that really push the limits.
I'm ready. What do you have for us?
Let's talk about bypassing network access control, or NAC for short.
NAC. Yeah, I've heard of that. It's like a security checkpoint for any device that wants to connect to a network, right?
Exactly, like a digital bouncer, checking IDs, making sure everyone is following the rules. NAC systems, they make sure only authorized devices, the ones with the right security settings, can actually get on the network.
So they're the gatekeepers. But I imagine even the toughest bouncer can be fooled. How do attackers get past these digital bouncers?
Just like in real life, there are ways to slip through. Attackers might try to spoof their MAC address. That's like a unique ID for a device. They try to make their device look like it's authorized.
So they're using fake IDs to get past security.
Pretty much. A lot of NAC systems rely on those MAC addresses for authentication. But attackers can use tools to change their MAC address, make it look legit to the NAC.
Clever. But what if the NAC is more advanced? What if it checks other things besides the MAC address?
Attackers have ways to deal with that too. They might look for vulnerabilities in the NAC system itself,
Yeah.
try to bypass its authentication, or even tunnel their traffic through different protocols so they don't get detected.
Tunnel their traffic. Sounds like they're digging a secret tunnel under the checkpoint.
That's a good way to put it. They might use SSH tunneling, VPNs, even stuff like DNS to hide their traffic and make it look like normal, harmless stuff.
So it's this constant game of cat and mouse. Attackers find ways to bypass things. Defenders try to stay one step ahead.
Always.
Yeah.
And another area where this happens is antivirus evasion.
Ah, antivirus software. That's the classic protection against malware, isn't it?
It is. But attackers are always coming up with new ways to avoid being detected by it.
So how do they make their malware invisible to those antivirus programs?
Well, one trick is to encrypt or obfuscate their code. It makes it harder for the antivirus to recognize the malware's signature, like putting a disguise on it, so it doesn't look dangerous.
So they're playing hide and seek with their malicious code.
Yep. And Kali Linux has tools for this too. Veil evasion, for example.
Yeah.
It can create encrypted payloads that are less likely to get caught by antivirus.
Veil evasion. Sounds like something a secret agent would use.
It's a powerful tool that lets penetration testers see how well those antivirus programs actually work, find any weaknesses that attackers could exploit.
So it's not just about finding vulnerabilities in the system itself. It's about figuring out how to get past the security measures that are already there. It's like a multi-layered problem.
Definitely. And talking about layers, another big part of penetration testing is privilege escalation.
Privilege escalation, what's that?
It's basically getting more access to a system than you should have. So imagine an attacker gets onto your system. Privilege escalation is how they go from being just a guest user to, like, the admin. They get control of your data, your whole infrastructure.
So even if they just slip through a small crack, they can use this to make that crack into a giant hole.
Right. And Kali Linux has tools for this. Like Metasploit, it has modules that can exploit vulnerabilities in operating systems and applications to gain those higher privileges.
Metasploit, again. That framework really seems like the all-in-one tool for penetration testing.
It's incredibly versatile, for sure. And there are lots of other techniques attackers use for privilege escalation. Exploiting kernel vulnerabilities, taking over system processes. They might even abuse user accounts that aren't set up properly.
It's a complicated field. And it's always changing. Makes you realize that cybersecurity is never really done. It's an ongoing fight.
That's true. And as we rely more and more on technology, the stakes are only going to get higher.
So, knowing all this, what can we do to protect ourselves? What are some key takeaways for our listeners?
The most important thing is to be proactive and use a layered approach to security. Like an onion, right? You want multiple layers of defense. If one fails, the others are still there.
So things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, antivirus software,
Yeah.
strong passwords, multi-factor authentication, keeping everything updated, all of that is essential.
Absolutely. Those are all critical parts of good security. But it's not just about the tech. It's also about educating people about security threats, teaching them good practices.
Right. Help people understand how to spot those phishing emails, avoid shady websites, be careful about what they share online.
Exactly. Human error, that's often the weakest link. If you can raise awareness, create a culture where people care about security, you can really reduce your risk.
Well, this deep dive into mastering Kali Linux has been a real eye-opener. It's been fascinating and a little bit scary to learn about all these different attack methods and how Kali Linux can be used for both good and bad.
It's been great exploring this with you. Remember, the more we know about how attackers think, the better prepared we'll be to defend ourselves and our digital world.
That's a great point. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive.
Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep those defenses strong.
And for our listeners out there, remember, knowledge is power. Keep learning and exploring this incredible world of cybersecurity.